Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. I never thought the sound of my father's voice could make my blood freeze. But that phone call on Amanda's 32nd birthday changed everything I believed about the people closest to me. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman I'd spent 8 years protecting was the one I needed protection from. My name is Blake Morrison, and for 12 years, I served in Army Special Forces before transitioning to private security consulting. I specialized in threat assessment and extraction operations for high-value targets. The skills that kept me alive in Afghanistan and Syria had become my livelihood in the civilian world, protecting executives and their families from kidnapping, extortion, and worse. What I never anticipated was needing those same skills to protect myself from my own wife. Amanda and I met at a charity gala in Dallas back in 2018. She was 24, stunning in that effortless way that comes from good genetics and expensive maintenance, working as an event coordinator for luxury hotels. I was 31, recently out of the service, building my security firm from the ground up. She seemed impressed by my military background, fascinated by the stories I could tell, though I kept the darkest ones to myself. Looking back, I realized she wasn't attracted to me as much as she was attracted to what I represented: stability, protection, and the substantial income that came with keeping rich people safe. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Amanda had this way of making everything feel urgent, important. Within 6 months, she was pregnant with Emma. We married quickly, a small ceremony that felt rushed even then. Amanda said she wanted to be a family before the baby came, but I suspect now she wanted to secure her position before I had time to think too clearly about what I was signing up for. Emma became the center of my world the moment she drew her first breath. 7 years old now, with Amanda's blonde hair and my gray eyes, she had this infectious laugh that could dissolve any tension in a room. She called me Daddy Bear and still insisted on bedtime stories every night, usually involving princesses who saved themselves instead of waiting for princes. I traveled frequently for work, but I never missed more than 3 days in a row. Emma was my anchor, the reason I'd walked away from the adrenaline and brotherhood of special operations to build something stable and lasting. Amanda, however, had become increasingly distant over the past 2 years. At first, I attributed it to the natural evolution of marriage, the way passion settles into routine. She started working out more, paying extra attention to her appearance, taking weekend trips with girlfriends. Classic signs, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. My work had made me suspicious of everyone's motives, and I didn't want to bring that toxicity home. The problems started subtle. Amanda began questioning my work schedule more aggressively, wanting detailed itineraries for every trip. She'd grown cold in bed, claiming exhaustion or headaches with increasing frequency. Our conversations became purely functional: Emma's school events, household expenses, social obligations. When I tried to address the distance between us, she'd deflect with tears or accusations that my job was consuming me, that I cared more about other people's safety than my own family's happiness. What bothered me most was how she'd started undermining my relationship with Emma. Little comments about how I was too strict, too paranoid, too focused on worst-case scenarios. She'd roll her eyes when I insisted on security protocols for Emma's school pickup or question the backgrounds of her friends' parents. "Not everyone lives in your dangerous world, Blake," she'd say, as if wanting to protect our daughter was somehow unreasonable. 3 months ago, I noticed Amanda had changed her phone's security settings. She'd always been casual about leaving it unlocked, but suddenly it required a fingerprint, and she guarded it like classified intelligence. She'd started going to the gym at odd hours, claiming the morning classes fit her schedule better. Her workout clothes were consistently cleaner than they should have been for someone supposedly pushing herself through intense fitness routines. Then there were the financial irregularities. Amanda had always handled our household accounts, but I maintained oversight of all major expenditures. Small charges appeared for restaurants I'd never been to, hotels during times when she claimed to be at home. When I asked about them, she had explanations ready: client lunches that ran late, spa days with girlfriends, last-minute overnight trips for work conferences. Everything plausible, everything defensible, but collectively forming a pattern that made my operational instincts scream warnings. My father, Frank Morrison, had been a detective with Dallas PD for 36 years before retiring. He'd raised me with a cop's skepticism about human nature, but also with an unshakable moral code about loyalty and family. Since my mother's death from cancer 5 years ago, he'd become even more protective of what remained of our family unit. He adored Emma, took her fishing every other weekend, and had always gotten along well with Amanda, though he'd occasionally made pointed comments about her expensive tastes. Frank had called me twice in the past month with seemingly casual questions about Amanda's whereabouts. "Thought I saw her car at that new steakhouse downtown last Tuesday," he'd mentioned. "Figured you two were having a date night." Well, I told him I'd been in Houston that day. He'd gone quiet for a moment before changing the subject. The second call came after he'd spotted Amanda leaving a hotel with a man he didn't recognize. "Probably nothing," he'd said, "but you know how my mind works." I should have paid closer attention to those calls, should have trusted the instincts that had kept me alive through 2 combat deployments. Instead, I convinced myself that Frank was being an overprotective father-in-law, seeing threats where none existed. I was too busy managing the security detail for a Fortune 500 CEO whose son had received credible kidnapping threats. Ironic, considering what was brewing in my own backyard. The birthday party had been Amanda's idea. Naturally, she wanted to celebrate at her parents' house with just family, which had expanded to include her brother's family, her sister's kids, and several people I'd never met who apparently qualified as close family friends. Amanda's parents lived in a sprawling ranch house in an upscale suburb, the kind of place where neighbors minded their own business and security cameras were decorative rather than functional. I'd spent the afternoon playing the dutiful husband, making small talk with Amanda's relatives, watching Emma blow out candles on an elaborate princess castle cake that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Amanda seemed more animated than she'd been in months, laughing loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny, touching my arm and calling me honey with renewed enthusiasm. Performance behavior I recognize now, designed to reinforce the image of our happy marriage for the assembled audience. Emma had been delighted to have her cousins there, running around the backyard with the other kids, her dress grass-stained and her face chocolate-smeared in the way that meant she was having genuine fun. I've been watching her through the kitchen window, thinking about how these were the moments that made all the travel and stress worthwhile when my phone rang. The tone in Frank's voice wasn't just urgent, it was terrified. In all my years of knowing him, through my mother's illness, through his toughest cases as a detective, I'd never heard him sound like that. The authority in his voice triggered every operational protocol I'd ever learned. When someone you trust tells you to move, you don't ask questions until you're in a secure location. I grabbed my daughter and ran out of the house, ignoring Amanda's confused protests and the startled looks from her family. Emma clung to me, sensing the urgency even if she didn't understand it, asking if we were playing a game as I buckled her into my truck and peeled out of the driveway. I drove to a coffee shop 3 miles away, somewhere public with multiple exit routes, before calling Frank back. "Blake, thank God you listened," he said, his breathing heavy. "I've been watching Amanda for 3 weeks. She's been meeting with someone you know from your military days. Troy Valdez. They've been planning something, and today was supposed to be the day." Troy Valdez. The name hit me like a physical blow, dragging up memories I'd worked years to suppress. Troy had been in my unit during my second deployment, a staff sergeant with a reputation for cutting corners and pushing boundaries. He'd been suspected of selling ammunition to local militias, but had transferred out before the investigation concluded. The last I'd heard, he'd been dishonorably discharged for conduct unbecoming. But that was 6 years ago. "What kind of planning?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "The kind that ends with you not coming home," Frank said. "I've got photos, recordings, documentation of meetings. They've been planning this for months, Blake. Whatever you did to this guy overseas, he's not over it. And Amanda, she's not the woman you thought you married." As I sat in that coffee shop parking lot, holding my daughter while she colored in a book I'd grabbed from the truck, the full scope of my situation began to crystallize. My wife had been orchestrating my elimination with someone from my past, someone who had legitimate reasons to want me dead. The birthday party had been theater, designed to establish alibis and create the perfect storm of circumstances for whatever they had planned. What I couldn't know yet was how deep the conspiracy went, how many people were involved, or what specific method they'd chosen to remove me from the equation. But I did know one thing with absolute certainty. Amanda and Troy had made a fatal error in judgment. They'd forgotten that I was very good at what I did, and that betrayal was the one sin I'd never learned to forgive. The war they'd started was about to become very real, and they had no idea what they'd awakened. The safe house Frank led me to was a nondescript apartment complex 20 minutes from downtown Dallas, the kind of place where residents minded their own business and paid rent in cash. He'd kept it as his unofficial office during his last years on the force, a place to meet confidential informants and store sensitive files that couldn't exist in official records. Now it would serve as our command center while I figured out exactly what Amanda and Troy had been planning. Emma was asleep on the small couch, exhausted from the day's excitement and confusion. I told her we were having an adventure, that sometimes grown-ups had to make quick decisions to keep everyone safe. She'd accepted this explanation with the resilience that children possess, but I knew I'd need better answers soon. For now, she was secure, and that was all that mattered. Frank spread the contents of 3 manila folders across the kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. Photographs, transcripts, financial records, surveillance notes written in his careful detective's handwriting. The scope of his investigation was impressive, even by my professional standards. Started watching her 6 weeks ago, he said, pouring coffee from a thermos he'd brought. Something about her behavior at Emma's school recital didn't sit right. Too much attention to her phone, too many glances at the exits. You taught me to notice those things, remember? The first photograph showed Amanda entering a downtown hotel. She was dressed professionally, carrying a leather portfolio, looking every inch the successful businesswoman. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, when she'd told me she was having lunch with her sister. She's been meeting him here twice a week for 3 months, Frank continued, sliding another photo across the table. This one showed Troy Valdez exiting the same hotel lobby. He'd aged since I'd last seen him, his hair thinner and his face harder, but the cocky bearing was unmistakable. They're careful about timing, never arrive or leave together, always book separate rooms. Professional-level operational security. I studied Troy's photograph, remembering the last time I'd seen him alive. It was during our final mission together, an extraction operation in Kandahar that had gone sideways due to intelligence that turned out to be deliberately compromised. 3 of our guys had walked into an ambush because someone had sold our route to the Taliban. Troy had been supposed to be providing overwatch from a building 2 blocks away, but when the shooting started, he was nowhere to be found. We'd fought our way out, barely, but Sergeant Mike Reeves hadn't made a home. Troy had claimed equipment failure, radio malfunction, plausible explanations that couldn't be definitively disproven. The investigation into the intelligence leak had focused on local interpreters and Afghan military liaisons, but I'd always suspected Troy's convenient absence wasn't coincidental. He'd transferred to a different unit 2 weeks later, and I'd been too focused on getting home alive to pursue it further. That had been a mistake. What else do you have? I asked. Frank pulled out a small digital recorder. Managed to get close enough to their window last Thursday. Hotel room acoustics aren't great, but you'll get the general idea. The recording was scratchy, but clear enough. Amanda's voice came through first, discussing logistics with the cold efficiency of a project manager. Blake's got a 3-day job in San Antonio next week. Corporate security for some oil executive. That gives us a window if we want to make it look like a work-related incident. Troy's response chilled me to the bone. Road accidents are cleaner, but harder to guarantee. I still think the home invasion angle works better. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. You and the kid weren't supposed to be there. Fought back. Tragic loss of a heroic husband and father. Emma can't be hurt, Amanda said. And for a moment, I thought I heard actual concern in her voice. That's non-negotiable. She won't be. Kid's more valuable alive anyway. Sympathy factor for the widow, Plus, the insurance won't pay out if there are too many questions about the circumstances. Insurance. Of course. The life insurance policy Amanda had insisted I increase last year, citing Emma's future education costs and the mortgage on our house. $3 million, enough to set them up comfortably for life. Frank had more recordings, each one revealing additional layers of their planning. They've been studying my routines, identifying vulnerabilities in my security protocols, even researching my client schedules to find the optimal time and place for my elimination. The level of detail was impressive in its thoroughness and terrifying in its implications. "There's something else," Frank said, pulling out a different folder. "Amanda's not who she told you she was." The background check he'd conducted revealed that Amanda Cross, her maiden name, had a history I'd never known about. 3 prior relationships with men who died under questionable circumstances. A fiancé in college who'd overdosed on prescription medication during a period when their relationship was struggling. A boyfriend in her early 20s who died in a motorcycle accident after she'd taken out a substantial insurance policy on him. A previous husband I'd never known existed, killed in a home invasion robbery that had netted less than $200 but had left Amanda with a $500,000 payout. "Professional level work," Frank said grimly. "She's been doing this for a decade, targeting men with assets and eliminating them once she's maximized her financial position. Troy's not her lover, Blake. He's her partner." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Emma wasn't the product of a passionate romance. She was leverage, designed to bind me emotionally while Amanda positioned herself for the ultimate payday. Every moment of our marriage had been performance. Every expression of love, a calculated manipulation designed to lower my guard and increase my net worth. But if Amanda and Troy thought they were dealing with one of her previous marks, they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. I wasn't a college student or civilian businessman. I was a special operations veteran with extensive training in exactly the kind of warfare they'd initiated. And unlike her previous victims, I now knew what they were planning. The next phase of their operation, according to Frank's intelligence, was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I was supposed to be providing security for Cameron Industries CEO during a shareholder meeting in San Antonio. Amanda would establish her alibi by attending a spa retreat with several friends, ensuring she was surrounded by witnesses when the tragic accident occurred on my drive home. Troy would be waiting along my usual route, armed with detailed knowledge of my travel patterns and vehicle specifications. The plan called for a staged collision that would look like a drunk driver had crossed the center line, followed by a fire to eliminate any forensic evidence that might contradict the accident narrative. Simple, brutal, and historically effective. I had 5 days to turn their trap against them. The first step was intelligence gathering. Using contacts from my military and security days, I began assembling a complete profile on Troy's activities since his discharge. He'd been living in Dallas for 2 years, working as a freelance security consultant for clients who required services that operated in legal gray areas. His specialty was making problems disappear permanently, and his client list read like a roster of people who'd probably deserve to disappear. More concerning was the discovery that Troy and Amanda hadn't been working alone. They'd assembled a small network of accomplices, including a corrupt police detective who specialized in ensuring certain investigations reached convenient conclusions, and a medical examiner who had a flexible interpretation of autopsy results. This wasn't a simple murder plot. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise with multiple fail-safes and exit strategies. Amanda, meanwhile, had been escalating her performance at home. She'd become more affectionate, more attentive, cooking my favorite meals and suggesting romantic evenings together. The irony of being seduced by someone planning my murder would have been amusing if it hadn't been so dangerous. I played along, matching her energy, even suggesting we take a family vacation after my San Antonio job was complete. "That sounds wonderful," she'd said, kissing my cheek while she planned my funeral. "We should start looking at destinations." On Friday, Troy made his first direct move. He called my office, claiming to be a potential client who needed immediate security consultation for a family member receiving death threats. When my assistant transferred the call, I recognized his voice immediately despite his attempt to disguise it. Blake Morrison? I think we knew each other overseas. Troy Valdez, remember? I'm in town on business and heard you'd gone into the security game. Think we could grab a beer and catch up? The audacity was stunning. He was calling to conduct pre-operational reconnaissance, confirming my location and schedule while maintaining plausible deniability about any hostile intent. I agreed to meet him that evening at a sports bar downtown, a public location where he'd feel safe and confident. What Troy didn't know was that I'd spent the afternoon preparing for war. The meeting was exactly what I'd expected. Troy had gained weight and lost some of the lean military bearing that had once made him an effective soldier. But his eyes still held the calculating coldness I remembered. He bought the first round, shared war stories, asked about my business and family with the false camaraderie of someone pumping an intelligence source. "Heard you married a real looker," he said, showing me a photo on his phone that I recognized as Amanda's professional headshot. "Kids too, right? Must be nice having something solid to come home to after all those years of uncertainty." "Amanda and Emma are everything to me," I replied, letting him hear the emotion in my voice. "I'd do anything to protect them." "Course you would. Family's what matters, right? Speaking of which, I should probably mention, I've been seeing your wife." The confession caught me off guard, not because of the revelation, but because of the timing. Troy was supposed to maintain operational security until Tuesday, but he couldn't resist the psychological warfare component of revealing his betrayal. It was the same arrogance that had gotten soldiers killed in Afghanistan. "What did you just say?" I asked, letting my voice carry the right note of shocked disbelief. "Amanda and I have been together for 8 months," he continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Started as a business arrangement, but it's become something more. She's not happy, Blake. Hasn't been for a long time. All that traveling you do, all that time away from home, it gets lonely for a woman like that." I stared at him for a long moment, letting him see the rage building in my expression. Then I stood up abruptly, knocking over my chair, and walked out of the bar without another word. Troy would interpret this as the reaction of a devastated husband learning about his wife's infidelity. What he'd actually witnessed was a predator who'd just confirmed the identity of his prey. That night, Amanda was waiting for me with wine and candles, ready to provide comfort for the emotional devastation she assumed Troy had inflicted. She held me while I pretended to process the news of her affair, stroking my hair and murmuring reassurances that we could work through anything together. "Marriage is complicated," she said softly. "People make mistakes, but what matters is family. What matters is Emma, and making sure she has the life she deserves." I agreed completely. Emma did deserve the life she was meant to have, one where her father was alive to provide it, and where the people who tried to destroy her family had paid the appropriate price for their betrayal. Sunday morning, I told Amanda I was going for a long drive to clear my head and think about her future. She kissed me goodbye with tears in her eyes, a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Instead of driving aimlessly, I met with a contact from my private security days who specialized in acquiring equipment that wasn't available through conventional channels. By Sunday evening, I had everything I needed to turn Tuesday's assassination attempt into something very different. The war they'd started was about to become a rout, and the only question remaining was how many of them would survive long enough to understand their mistake. Tuesday arrived with the kind of clear Texas sky that seemed designed for new beginnings. Amanda kissed me goodbye at the front door, her performance flawless as always, reminding me to drive safely and call when I reached San Antonio. Emma hugged my legs tight and made me promise to bring her back something special for my trip. Neither of them would ever see me leave the house again, though for very different reasons. I'd spent Monday night finalizing my preparations while Amanda slept beside me, her breathing calm and regular as someone with no guilt on her conscience. The plan I developed was complex but necessary. Troy and Amanda had built their trap with multiple layers of redundancy, and dismantling it required the same methodical approach I'd used in special operations. Every variable had to be controlled, every contingency planned for, every enemy asset neutralized. The camera industry's job was real, and I fully intended to complete it professionally. But instead of driving my usual route home along Highway 35, I'd arranged for alternate transportation that would put me exactly where I needed to be at exactly the right time. Troy was expecting to ambush Blake Morrison, the unsuspecting husband. Instead, he'd encounter Blake Morrison, the Special Forces veteran who'd been hunting him for 5 days. At 3:47 p.m., I received the expected call from Troy's police contact, Detective Raymond Costas, informing me that there'd been an incident involving my wife and suggesting I return home immediately. The tremor in his voice told me he was genuinely shaken, which meant the first phase of my operation had proceeded exactly as planned. I'd returned to Dallas that morning using back roads and secondary highways, arriving at our house while Amanda was supposedly driving to her spa retreat. Frank had been watching the house since dawn, confirming that she'd left at 9:15 a.m., driving her silver BMW toward the interstate. What she didn't know was that I'd been waiting in the garage since 8:30, having entered through the basement workshop that connected to the storm drain system I'd mapped during my home security assessment. Amanda returned at 11:20, accompanied by Troy and 2 men I didn't recognize. They moved through the house with professional efficiency, placing surveillance equipment and staging evidence that would support the narrative of my death. I watched from the hidden security room I'd built in the basement, recording everything through cameras they didn't know existed. The conversation they had while preparing my house for widowhood revealed the full scope of their operation. Amanda had been working with Troy for 3 years, systematically identifying and eliminating targets across Texas and Oklahoma. I was number 7 on a list that included 2 other military veterans, 3 successful businessmen, and a retired federal judge. The insurance payouts alone had totaled over $12 million, but that was secondary to the primary objective. Troy was eliminating everyone who'd been present during the mission where Sergeant Reeves had died. Morrison was the unit intelligence officer, Troy explained to his associates. He knew I'd sold the route information, knew I'd left those guys to die. He never said anything official, but he knew. Eventually, that knowledge would have become a problem. Amanda's response was pure ice. Well, after today, it won't be a problem anymore, and Emma and I will be well compensated for our tragic loss. Hearing her discuss my daughter's future with such casual calculation triggered something primal in my response matrix. These people weren't just planning to murder me. They were planning to steal Emma's father and then use her as a prop in their grief performance. The level of psychological damage they were prepared to inflict on a 7-year-old child to maintain their cover made them legitimate targets for extreme prejudice. At 2:15 p.m., I activated the real plan. The gas leak in our kitchen was subtle but accumulating, designed to reach critical concentration by the time Amanda and Troy returned from establishing their alibis. They planned to make my death look accidental, so it seemed appropriate that their deaths would appear similarly coincidental. The beauty of natural gas explosions is that they eliminate most forensic evidence while appearing to be genuine accidents. What I hadn't anticipated was Amanda's maternal instinct finally asserting itself. At 2:45, she called Emma's school and instructed them to release our daughter to my father for early pickup. Frank, who'd been monitoring all communications, intercepted the call and actually did collect Emma, taking her to the safe house, where she'd be secure regardless of how the afternoon concluded. At 3:30, Amanda and Troy returned to the house with their 2 associates, ready to implement the final stage of their plan. They had no idea that the hunting rifle I'd supposedly taken to San Antonio was actually positioned in the tree line behind our property, or that I'd been tracking their movements through military-grade surveillance equipment since they'd entered the neighborhood. The engagement began when Troy's explosives expert, a thin man with prison tattoos and nervous eyes, detected the gas concentration and began shouting warnings. Troy immediately realized they'd walked into a counter-operation and started issuing orders to evacuate, but by then I'd already triggered the electronic ignition system I'd installed in the kitchen ventilation hood. The explosion shattered every window on the ground floor and set the interior walls ablaze, but the 4 conspirators had been close enough to the front door to escape the initial blast. They stumbled into the front yard, singed and disoriented, but very much alive and very much aware that their assassination plot had been compromised. That's when I opened fire. The first shot took down the explosives expert from 200 yards, a clean headshot that dropped him instantly. The second shot shattered Troy's left kneecap, sending him sprawling onto the driveway with a scream that could be heard over the burning house. Amanda and the fourth man, who I now recognized as Detective Costas, dove for cover behind her BMW. "Blake!" Troy shouted across the yard, his voice strained with pain and fury. "You think you're so fucking smart? You think this ends here? There are 8 more targets on my list, and if I don't make it out of this, my partners know exactly where to find them all." I adjusted my scope and put the third shot through the BMW's engine block, ensuring they wouldn't be driving away from this conversation. Then I began moving through the woods toward their position, using cover and concealment techniques that Troy should have remembered from our time in Afghanistan. "Here's the thing about your list," I called back, my voice carrying clearly across the burning property. "I already know about it. Found the whole database when I broke into your apartment last night. Amazing what people keep on their computers these days." The silence that followed told me they were beginning to understand the scope of their situation. I'd had access to their operational files for 36 hours, which meant I knew the identities of their other targets, their methods, their timetables, and most importantly, their escape routes and safe houses. Detective Costas made his move first, abandoning Amanda and sprinting toward the neighbor's fence line. I let him get 20 yards before putting a round through his spine. He dropped face first into Mrs. Patterson's rose garden, twitching once before going still. "That leaves just you two," I announced, continuing my approach. "Amanda, I want you to know that Emma is safe. She's with my father, and she'll never have to know what kind of monster her mother really was." Amanda stood up slowly from behind the car, her hands raised, her face streaked with soot and tears. She was still beautiful, still perfectly composed despite the circumstances, still trying to find an angle that would let her survive this encounter. "Blake, please," she said, her voice breaking in exactly the way it had on our wedding day. "I know how this looks, but you don't understand the whole situation. Troy forced me into this. He threatened Emma, threatened to hurt her if I didn't cooperate. I've been trying to protect our daughter." The performance was impressive, but I'd heard her real voice on Frank's recordings. I knew exactly what kind of predator was wearing my wife's face. 8 months, I said, moving into the open where they could see me clearly. "According to the hotel records, you've been meeting with Troy for 8 months. Emma's only 7 years old, Amanda. Your timeline doesn't work." Troy was trying to apply pressure to his shattered knee while reaching for a pistol he'd dropped when I shot him. I put a round into the ground 6 inches from his head, and he stopped moving. "The thing is," I continued, "I might have been willing to discuss terms if this had just been about me. Soldiers understand that war has casualties, and if Troy wanted revenge for something that happened overseas, we could have settled that between us. But you made this about Emma. You were planning to orphose her and then use her grief as cover for your next operation. That's where you crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Amanda's composure finally cracked completely. "She's your daughter. How can you do this to her mother?" "Easy," I replied, and shot Troy through the head. Amanda screamed and fell to her knees, but I was already moving toward her position. The fire department would be arriving soon, and I needed this conversation concluded before civilian responders entered the scene. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, kneeling down so we were at eye level. "You're going to walk into that burning house. You're going to make it look like you died trying to save your husband from the gas explosion. Your death will be ruled accidental, which means Emma will inherit both our life insurance policies and won't have to grow up knowing her mother was a serial killer." "You can't make me," she whispered. "Actually, I can. The alternative is that you get arrested, tried, and convicted for multiple homicides, which means Emma spends the rest of her childhood visiting her mother in prison and dealing with the media attention for being the daughter of a Black Widow killer. Which option do you think serves her better?" Amanda stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for any trace of the man she'd manipulated and deceived for 8 years. What she found there made her realize that this version of Blake Morrison had no intention of negotiating or showing mercy. You always were too sentimental about that kid, she said, her mask finally coming off completely. She's not even yours, you know. I was already pregnant when we met, had no idea who the father was. You were just the most convenient mark I could find. The revelation should have devastated me, but instead it clarified everything. Emma wasn't my biological daughter, but she was still my daughter in every way that mattered. And now she'd be free to grow up without the toxic influence of a mother who saw her as nothing more than leverage in a criminal enterprise. Thank you for telling me, I said sincerely. Now I don't have to feel guilty about this. Amanda tried to run, but smoke inhalation and injuries from the explosion had left her unsteady. I caught her easily and carried her toward the burning house despite her struggles. At the threshold, she stopped fighting and looked at me with something that might have been respect. She'll figure out eventually, you know. Emma's smart. She'll realize what really happened here. Maybe, I agreed. But by then she'll be old enough to understand that sometimes good people have to do terrible things to protect the people they love. I pushed Amanda into the flames and walked away without looking back. The official investigation concluded that Amanda Morrison had died heroically attempting to rescue her husband from a gas explosion caused by faulty equipment. Blake Morrison had unfortunately been in San Antonio on business when the tragedy occurred, but had rushed home immediately upon hearing the news. The deaths of Troy Valdez and his associates in the same incident were attributed to their presence as contractors hired to investigate a suspected gas leak. Wrong place, wrong time. Detective Costas was ruled a separate casualty, killed by debris from the explosion while investigating reports of the gas smell. The fact that he'd been shot was attributed to damage from flying metal fragments, and his history of taking bribes was never discovered by the official investigation. Emma grieved for her mother with the intensity that children bring to all their emotions, but she recovered with the resilience that had always amazed me. I told her that sometimes accidents happen to good people, that her mother had died trying to help others, and that our job now was to remember all the happy times we'd shared together. We moved to Austin 6 months later, partly for a fresh start, and partly because I'd established new operational parameters that required distance from old connections. Emma adapted quickly, making new friends and excelling in a school that specialized in gifted students. She still called me Daddy Bear, still insisted on bedtime stories, but now she also helped me plan our weekend adventures and had started asking when she could learn to shoot. Frank visited every other weekend, maintaining his role as the devoted grandfather while also serving as Emma's connection to the family history she'd inherited. He never mentioned the events of that Tuesday, never asked questions about details that hadn't made it into official reports. Some conversations were better left unspoken. Troy's hit list had contained the names of 6 other targets, all veterans from our unit who'd been present during the mission where Sergeant Reeves died. I contacted each of them through secure channels, providing enough information about the threat to let them take appropriate precautions. 3 of them relocated immediately. 2 others hired professional security. The 6th man, Staff Sergeant Colin Wright, thanked me for the warning and then disappeared entirely, leaving only a forwarded message that read, "Consider it handled." I never asked what he meant by that, and I never tried to contact Troy's remaining associates. Some problems solve themselves if you're patient enough to let them develop naturally. These days, my security consulting business focuses exclusively on family protection services. I help parents assess threats to their children, design security protocols for domestic situations, and occasionally provide more specialized services for clients who've discovered that people they trusted have been planning their elimination. It's satisfying work, and the operational skills translate perfectly. Emma is 9 now, still brilliant and fearless, and convinced that her father can handle any problem the world throws at them. She's not wrong about that. Every night when I tuck her in, she asks if I'm going to be here when she wakes up, and every night I promise her that nothing will ever take me away from her again. It's a promise I intend to keep, regardless of what that requires. Some people might call what I did to Amanda and Troy excessive, brutal, or even evil. Those people have never had someone threaten their child while planning their murder. They've never been betrayed by someone they loved. never had their family targeted by predators who saw them as nothing more than a paycheck. I sleep perfectly well at night because I know that Emma is safe, that the people who wanted to hurt us are gone, and that anyone foolish enough to target my family in the future will discover exactly how far a father is willing to go to protect his daughter. The war they started is over. They lost, and Emma and I won something infinitely more valuable than revenge. We won the rest of our lives together, free from the shadows of people who would have stolen our future for money. In the end, that's all that matters.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.